Last night, Donald Trump delivered his first, and perhaps only, primetime address of the Iran war. I would describe it as fairly normal. But it hides how the Iran war has created an utterly bizarre situation for the rest of US domestic politics. So my plan for today is to discuss what Trump was attempting to do with the speech. Then we will touch on some important recurring topics from this channel's history, in a manner that tries to present a coherent narrative for the overall political situation that we find ourselves in. I will start by discussing the disconnect between the military coverage and the political coverage of the war, and how it is further clouding what us national security-minded folks ought to think of it. Then we will examine the political fallout for the 2028 presidential race, and how something fascinating is happening involving J.D. Vance. Finally, I will give an update on the NATO situation, and how Trump saying nothing about the alliance in the speech actually says quite a bit. Okay, first a brief summary of the speech. Trump's address began with praise for the crew behind the Artemis II launch, which will soon bring humans the furthest from Earth that they have ever been. In a world full of chaos, it was nice to spend an hour yesterday watching something fun. It has been a while. Anyway, heading into the speech, most of the speculation was that Trump would lay out a clear plan for how to bring the Iran war to a close, with perhaps some explicit threats to NATO to cap off the last few days of strained transatlantic relations. In fact, he barely touched on either of those topics. Obviously, we will save the NATO part for later. Regarding an end to the war, I am not sure what useful information anyone expected to come out of that. It takes two to tango, and Trump cannot dictate the terms of a settlement, never mind know when the settlement will be reached, without a cooperative dance partner. Instead, the address centered on Trump making the case for the war more generally, putting aside the standard stretching of claims that you would get in any speech like this. The bulk of the speech was essentially a persuasive argument. The threat that Iran posed to the United States and allies, what needs to be done to reduce the threat, and how the costs that the United States will pay to accomplish the task at hand are worth the potential upside. It may have still lacked a clear bullet point list of the US aims, but it was getting there. Indeed, it is the type of speech that presidents past would have made for weeks or months ahead of the start of the war, similar to what George W. Bush did in the lead-up to the Iraq War. It is the type of speech that Trump should have given during his historically long State of the Union address, delivered just 4 days before the bombs started falling on Iran. Instead, he spent more time talking about US men's hockey. In effect, Trump is trying to play catch-up, having made political errors in January and February that set the stage for the Iran war to be the least popular start of a war in US polling history. Now, in our politically polarized world, it is doubtful that a persuasion campaign would have changed the minds of the Democratic base. But there still is a large pool of independents in the United States, and they have mostly sided with Democrats regarding the war. However, in terms of shifting opinions now, I suspect that the ship has sailed here. Democrats and independents will not be persuaded by a comprehensive narrative that tries to justify the war at this point. I also doubt that many Democrats will change their minds regardless of how the war ends, even if the Iranian regime falls and a more Western-friendly government takes its place. It is telling that the social media landscape often treats statements from the Iranian government as gospel, even though every leader throughout time should be subject to our say versus do warning. Perhaps positive war outcomes will move the needle for independence, but even then, I would not expect massive effects. The lack of a coherent narrative entering the war has caused downstream effects on media coverage of the battle, which has, in turn, negatively distorted the pursuit of the war. I mentioned before that the primary things American voters are thinking about when it comes to Iran are not the military situation and corresponding effects, but rather the economic effects, namely changes to gas prices and dips in the stock market. This has created an interesting situation where the Pentagon and State Department are tuning their strategies according to the market's reactions, and less in response to the military situation compared to a more standard war. The clearest consequences of this policy are the various waivers that the United States has placed on otherwise sanctioned oil, including Iran's own oil. The theory inside of the administration is that you cannot continue the war if gas prices remain elevated. So it is okay to essentially take actions that eventually result in more money handed over to Iran. All of that cash matters little in the long run if the government is blown away. I can see a world where that works, but it also means that the Trump administration is turning a high leverage situation into an even higher leverage situation. If the war goes poorly, then the downstream consequences of all of those weird economic policies will be magnified. Well, the media has correspondingly focused on those news items. What the average American is therefore not fully grasping are the military consequences of the war. And with very few fatalities, it is easy for those consequences to remain hidden. Yes, you will get snippets of how the war affects Russia in the short term, and China in the long term. So your average voter is not oblivious. But the lack of major media outlets focusing on the military side of things is causing problems even for people like us, who are more concerned about the bigger geopolitical picture. You do not need me to tell you that every weapon fired on Iran is a weapon that cannot deter China later. But you and I both need to have a better sense of just how many weapons have been fired to know the extent of the problem, and weigh the risks against the possible benefits that may come out of Iran. For example, let's look at the Tomahawk, considering that there is endless B-roll of those being fired during the war. I could cite some ballpark figures for what is happening with them. The United States has exhausted something like 900 Tomahawks over a month. That may be 20% or more of the US stockpile. The good news for the White House is that it is unlikely that the United States will need to use many more, because you do not need to rely on them when you have air superiority. You can switch to JDAMs, which are cheaper, plus the Pentagon effectively has an endless supply of them. However, the United States has only been procuring 90 new Tomahawks each year, though the Pentagon believes that production lines could expand to more than 2,000 annually without too much strain. And that is basically what I can tell you about that, with a major caveat that I would not trust any of those numbers. A lot of that is speculation coming from people like me, who are informed about the general situation, but not privy to private facts. If we really wanted reliable information here, we would need the larger media outlets to focus their investigative reporting efforts in that direction. And they do to some extent, which is part of how I could give you those figures. But they are not investing heavily in that side of the story, because it is not the side that Americans care about. And, fair enough, affordability is a major issue, and it has a clear impact on Americans' daily lives right now. It is just troubling that a critical national security issue remains underreported, in large part due to how the Trump administration pursued this war, and what yesterday's primetime address was supposed to be undoing. Meanwhile, the war's political ramifications inside of the Beltway have been astonishing. Since the start of Trump's second term, J.D. Vance has been the prediction market favorite for winning the 2028 presidential election. This was less a reflection of the market's belief that Republicans were in good shape for 2028, and more that he had effectively boxed out other potential Republican candidates. Even if your party is less than 50% likely to win the election, your own personal odds may be good if it is close to certain that you will win your party's nomination. As a result, J.D. Vance's odds to become president peaked at 30.5% on September 30th, 2025. However, the start of 2026 was rough for Vance, again less a reflection on him and more about the Republican Party in general. It turns out that ice on the streets will cause your numbers to slip. But it was the start of the Iran war that caused his numbers to enter freefall. On February 27th, his odds were 23.1%. Fast forward to today, and he is no longer the most likely next president of the United States. Now it is Gavin Newsom, edging Vance 19.2% to 19.0%. This is now a combination of two effects. One is the market generally thinking Republicans are facing an uphill battle in 2028. The other is a growing expectation that Rubio will challenge Vance for the Republican nomination. Rubio started the war at 9.0% and has moved to 11.5% today, off from a peak of 16.8% on March 11th. The decline from the last 3 weeks is less about Rubio and more about the Republican Party, and Vance's numbers also reflect that a successful primary battle against Rubio will leave him with enough of a political black eye that it will hurt him in the general election. In any case, as I have mentioned before, keep your eyes on Rubio over the next 7 months. If the 2026 midterm elections are a blue wave, a Rubio resignation will tell you exactly what his plans are for 2028, and also cause plenty of panic from Europeans who prefer working with him compared to the rest of the Trump administration. Speaking of Europe, let's close out with the NATO situation. Remember, earlier in the week, France and Spain closed off their airspaces to U.S. aircraft that were ultimately headed to the Gulf. This led the administration to discussing how such a stance will force the United States to reconsider its role in NATO. That, in turn, led to speculation that Trump would issue some type of ultimatum against NATO in his primetime address. Instead, he had brief comments about how allies who depend on oil shipments coming out of the Gulf should be willing to contribute to Gulf security. And that was about it. No discussion of how the United States will be leaving Brussels next month unless allied states take certain actions. I think it is worth reviewing the logic behind where some think this is going. President Trump is upset about basing and airspace rights in Europe, mostly in regard to Spain and France. His solution to the problem, according to the public speculation, is to leave NATO? Okay, if you leave NATO, guess what happens next? More of your European bases start to disappear. Not all of them, of course. Many NATO allies would want to extend bilateral commitments to keep the United States engaged. But some of those bases will disappear. The threat to leave NATO, therefore, does not solve the president's problem. It only makes it worse. Now, that is not to say that the situation is free from further strain. There are many other steps that Trump could take here. He could, for example, adopt a liberal interpretation of Article 5 and provide token assistance to restore security to the North Atlantic area in the event that a previously uncooperative ally is attacked. Then again, that has been an ongoing question regarding Spain, and its lack of commitment to spend 5% of GDP on defense, something that everyone else has signed on to. The point is that contentious NATO politics are far from over, but the idea of a US departure would be counterproductive for the White House. And in a world where you can make a lot of threats without directly incurring costs for doing so, one should keep that in mind the next time that the White House floats that possibility. So, what are our takeaway lines for today? Trump's primetime address yesterday was the speech that he should have given 2 months ago. The economic focus of the war is distorting both the overall strategy and our ability to understand its true geopolitical costs. I would not want to be J.D. Vance right now. And despite the current rift, leaving NATO would only create further problems for the White House. Okay, time for me to go on a very long walk with my dog. May I suggest that you do the same? I have a bunch of longer videos on my secondary channel that make for some good listening while you do that. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.